Good morning and welcome to a new series of What If. Do you remember this?
We qualified for the World Cup. Go and compete. We'll prepare and we'll go and we'll do our best. We'll put them under pressure. The game is about being effective, being aggressive, winning the ball, getting on with the play. We'll put them under pressure.
This morning we're going to look at one of the great what-ifs of recent Irish sporting history. Specifically the idea that the advent of the Celtic Tiger economy can be traced back to an injury Paul Mackay received while playing for Scotland in Bulgaria on a wet Wednesday in November 1987. Mackay was the great hope from Parkhead and the man most likely to make Irish dreams come true by scoring for Scotland. Scotland had to beat Bulgaria in order for Jack Charlton's Irish team to qualify for the European Cup finals in Germany in 1988. Mackay was replaced by the relatively unknown Hearts player Gary Mackay, winning his first cap for his country. He did the unthinkable and scored in the 87th minute and secured Ireland's passage to the finals. But what if he hadn't scored? Would Ireland have boomed its way through the 1990s? Is it really the case that positive sentiment as a result of sporting achievement is inextricably linked to the revival of a flagging economy? Joining me to discuss this, journalist Eoghan Corry, who has written prolifically on Irish sport, and Ronan Furlong, football fanatic and amateur economist, who came up with the idea for this what if. Ronan, could you explain this idea to a sceptical audience?
Well, Diarmaid, I suppose many economists have argued over what the advent of the Celtic Tiger really was, whether it was EU structural funding or the education system, whatever you want to say it was, the separation of church and state. There's no question in my mind that it was all to do with the confidence factor engendered in the country once we qualified for Euro 88.
And that, of course, ultimately led on to June 1990 and all that followed. I presume this isn't a specifically Irish thing. There was mention at the previous World Cup of global financial analysts talking about the importance of victory for Germany or Japan in terms of reviving their economy. So it's not a crackpot idea in that sense.
Not at all. It's for more eminent economists than me now to trace the exact linkages between a nation's mood and its confidence and its economic performance. But you only have to look at, I think it was the World Bank or the IMF making a statement during the Korean World Cup that they'd like Japan or Germany to win in order to boost their flagging economies and help the world economy generally. So there definitely is something there in terms of how countries operate during a confidence boost, and sport is obviously the big adrenaline factor in most Western economies, especially. So it's a case of tongue in cheek. It was certainly one of the factors that led to the economic boom of the 90s, and we have a fairly unheralded Scottish footballer, Gary Mackay, to thank for it.
And poor Gary didn't exactly have a spectacular career with Scotland after that first cap.
He didn't do an awful lot now, in fairness. I think recently he received another case of Irish whiskey from some dedicated fans here, and he offered to go over to Switzerland a while back to be the mascot for the Irish team for the game in Basel. I'm not sure if he went, but we subsequently lost, so maybe he wasn't there. Maybe it's for Brian Kerr to bring him back into the fold at this stage.
Oh, what do you think of this?
There was nothing in it for Scotland that night. It was quite a remarkable result. It was also important because RT, which weren't very good at getting rights, they managed to get the rights to the game, so Irish people saw it for themselves. The whole, what Jack Charlton brought to the country was not so much a boost in confidence, but a way of identifying our problems and solving them, going about them. We didn't have the sort of quality players to pass through the middle, is the phrase he used to use. So he devised a game which could be summed up in the words of the song as put them under pressure. If we applied that to the economics of the country, we didn't have the natural resources, we weren't going to go out and outperform the large European economies. We were hanging on at the tail end there with Portugal and Greece and Spain. But what people began to think about is, like, we can go out, compete in markets, and put people under pressure. We're not going to win. Don't stop thinking winning. Just think of getting there. Interesting that the very first thing he says in that song is, we've qualified for the World Cup. That was beyond our dreams at the time. We'd been invited in 1950 and hadn't gone. We'd missed in goal difference in 1934 and 1982, but we'd finally got there. And I think anyone who remembers that summer of 1990, the memory is a mad party, people jumping into fountains, singing the song, olaying away, and it was all to do with playing and being there. And I think after 1990, the whole attitude of the country had changed. It wasn't a big deal to be there. We are a vibrant economy. We can go out and compete. We've come from being the second poorest economy in the EU to being the second richest.
To go back to 1988, though, which started this in many ways, when I heard that song, I was thinking of another song, Joxer Goes to Stuttgart. Do you remember that?
Exactly.
Christy Moore's song about 1988. But he made a very serious point later on when he was reflecting on that song, that he was delighted to be able to write about young Dublin people in a song that didn't have to talk about heroin or contraception or unemployment, that he was talking about
or even emigration, Jeremy.
Yeah,
that
they
was
were leaving.
a big factor at the end of the 80s. We were just coming through an absolute hemorrhage of young people, and if you go look at Christy Moore, if you look at Dermot Bulger wrote a play in High Germany which traced the travels of an Irish emigrant from Germany during Euro 88.
A lot of artistic output out of those experiences, and Night in November, Mary Jones would have been sort of bringing another cross-border equation to it, which is another thing that was unleashed by the Jack Charlton experience. That Ray Houghton goal is pretty insignificant in European football history. It's very, very big for us because we unburdened ourselves of this comparison with England and this problem with England, which had been hanging over since the Civil War. And it's like Ray Houghton solved all those problems in one 8-minute goal in Mackay Stadium.
Here's a little reminder of that goal.
So a free kick to Ireland then, just inside their own half of the field. Kevin Moran to take it. Right foot hits it long towards the left side of the English penalty area. Stapleton surrounded by two white shirts. Galvin gets the ball looking for Aldridge. England defence in a mess. Aldridge going for the high ball, trying to knock it down for Houghton. Goal! Ireland have scored! Ray Houghton, less than 6 minutes gone in the game. John Aldridge, the Liverpool 1-2. John Aldridge heading down to Ray Houghton, looping header from him, completely beat Peter Shelton. A 9-0 goal up, just less than 6 minutes played.
Still raises the hairs on the back of our heads. Owen, that coincided with the beginnings of good economic news as well.
People didn't really realise it because it was hidden away in the small print of the CSO, but 1987 was the year we got our first trade surplus. The trade surplus boomed, and it meant that we were exporting more than we were importing. It grew very, very fast. It grew to 3 billion in 1989. And you can see why the football confidence, everything, it's welded together in people's imaginations. We came from a time when Christy Moore's anthem was The Ordinary Man Who's Been Thrown Out of Work to Joxer Goes to Stuttgart. And it then had a further growth and development. I mean, the growth slowed a little bit after 1990 and 94. USA 94 it actually was down in the previous year. So, connecting it with the football performances, it does go a little bit awry. But after the Charlton era, we parted company with Charlton in the qualifiers for the European Championship in '96, and the Celtic Tiger really got legs, and it seems to have been that Charlton and his football team and all that happened in our heads over that period, it paved the way for what became the Celtic Tiger. He said, go out, compete. There was a song, Give It a Lash, Jack. That wasn't Jack's philosophy at all. That was Mick Doyle's. He never said that. His thing was, go out and compete, put them under pressure. We moved from through that phase into a situation where we could actually go out and start winning, and some of the major exporters and some of the major agri-food sectors, CRH in particular, and obviously in software, we moved out and we started winning. We started coming the top of those little charts that the economic magazines produce.
And the irony of that is now, from a wet November night in Sofia in 1987, we now have the Celtic clubs buying up most of Sofia in terms of the apartment developments over there. So it really has come full circle in some sort of perverse symmetry. Maybe we've had too much of a good thing, or we're overconfident and overcocky as a result of it.
Well, is that linked as well to a certain backlash to the Charlton years as well, in terms of celebrations of mediocrity, it being enough to get there, be thankful for small mercies, we're a small country,
Charlton said what would have happened if he'd won. There was such a magnificent day in July when they brought the team home and they flew the plane low over the city so people could see the crowds and crowds and crowds of people out. Nelson Mandela visited that day. The Dublin legend about the chant about ooh ah Paul McGrath's da going up above the crowd. And Charlton looked at the crowd and said, what would have happened if we'd won? We got a bigger crowd than the German team which had won the World Cup. It does beg the question, Denmark, Greece recently, they've won European Championships. They've had real causes to celebrate. We should be in there winning at the levels that we have done at under 16 and under 18 level. And when do we stop celebrating mediocrity?
But doesn't this, in a sense, prove Eamon Dunphy's point?
And Roy Keane's point. Definitely, in the sense that we're no longer willing to settle for second best. Maybe we've taken the view that we're as good as everyone else, and if not better, and we're going out to claim what's rightfully or wrongfully ours in many instances. So you have this new kind of confidence, and maybe some people nowadays would call it brashness. Maybe we've moved away from those innocent days of just being along for the ride and getting swept up in the emotions of everything. Nowadays it's a serious business, and we're going to compete against other countries.
You can tell a nation's self-esteem, I think, from the way they react to sport. I think the penalty shootout, which is presumably almost completely a random event, you can see the countries that regularly lose penalty shootouts and the countries that regularly win them. Germany is a team that never loses penalty shootouts. We have a pretty good record out there as well, at under 16, under 18 level as well. I know we lost crucially in Korea, but our heads have been wrecked by the events. I think that we've moved from a situation where we were waiting for things to go wrong, and that is the crucial thing that happened when Gary Mackay scored. It was the first time we've moved from a soccer culture where we were waiting for things to go wrong. We were talking about the great disallowed goals Frank Stapleton had in Brussels and Paris and Sofia. Now, if an Irish team has a goal disallowed, you don't remember it because we take it as part of these slings and arrows of outrageous fortune that we'll get a break somewhere when a bad break goes.
Well, having said that, if you look at the actual record, Ireland's record in the World Cup, you're talking about one victory from normal time in the two campaigns.
It was the way we played Germany.
But this is my point though about if you think back to 1990 in particular. I remember being in pubs every time Eamon Dunphy came on. There were all sorts of missiles being hurled at the screens. Nobody was really listening to what he was saying, and we have a clip here of some of that war of words that was going on.
Well, I think a lot of people got it wrong, and it's amazing what you can say on television. What you actually say and what people think you say is two different things altogether. What Eamon actually said at half-time was that he was ashamed for Irish football in the way that we played against Egypt. And people then, I saw it in the paper afterwards, that Eamon Dunphy said he was ashamed to be Irish.
I said that the style of play didn't reflect the qualities of the players in the side, and that it was embarrassing and shameful that an Irish team with players like Ronnie Whelan and David O'Leary and Paul McGrath should be playing in this style, and that finally against Egypt it was revealed to be bankrupt. I've been one of his biggest supporters.
You have?
Because I believe in pragmatism, and the guys who I wrote a piece for the Sunday Times a few weeks ago, which was almost an apologia for him.
Even at the level of criticism of the performance.
Don't tell me about criticism because I haven't read any of it yet. The only criticism I've heard from is what you say. As far as I know, I've never read any of it. I haven't heard any of it. We've had a report back with Eamon Dunphy on the television, who was about as much relevance to us as a fly on the windowsill.
But those criticisms that Eamon Dunphy were making, history proved him correct. Essentially, Ireland did begin a much more open and attacking type of football after Charlton had gone.
It depends on who you had. I don't think the team of the early 80s would have been playing like the team of 1990 because we had far more talented, more talent up front. What Charlton really did was he brought together players which weren't making the first teams of Premiership clubs and got them up against talent which was immensely more valuable. He put them under pressure is literally what he did, because every time one of these very highly paid Italians or Germans looked up, there was a green shirt or two green shirts bearing down on them. They were talented enough to pass the ball with pinpoint precision 2 or 3 times, but after a while their systems broke down. What Charlton did was looked at other people's systems and broke them down. Now obviously that's a transitional thing. What Dunphy said in 1988 was we are not designed to play 3 matches in a very short period of time, because we just are so tired from the way we play and we're going to have to change the entire system if we're going to win a world-class tournament. He was proved right, but I think with what Charlton was dealing with at the time, we had to go through that transition.
Ironically, he inherited some very strong players, and you'd ask yourself the question, how would Brian Kerr get on with a group of players like Charlton inherited? At the start of his reign, he eased out some very good players early on in his reign, if you like. The Bradys of the world and people like that never really got to play on the big stage. But just going back to the point about the nation's image reflecting in its football team, you see it yourself in the stereotypes that the commentators march out in relation to the Latin temperament in some of the Italian or Portuguese players or something like that. You see a reflection of the nation's confidence. Well, it's all becoming a bit more homogenized, I suppose, and with the professional era, people are competing on a kind of like-by-like basis, and that's where Ireland's success lies. In some respects, we've dragged everyone down to our level, but we've also the Italians, in terms of the way we approach things.
There are people who say that the way we played in that 88 to 96 period, actually, teams have changed their game. I mean, the Dutch would have definitely changed their game in 88 to stretch us, to bring us, playing very, very wide, because they knew that that was the flaw in our game. And I do think that a new Charlton arriving now, looking at the systems and trying to disrupt them in the way that he did, everybody has learned, everybody has moved on, and in many respects, that's a good analogy for what some of these accession countries are going to do in terms of our economic performance. Everyone has learned, what our tricks were in the old days, and maybe they're going to try and replicate them to our. It would be lovely if they did. I mean, it's not to our cost. If the 10 accession states take the things that we did right, they got our education system right, we got the investment right, and
corporate tax.
If they succeed, it would be superb. It would be lovely to have. We cannot have a World Cup where everybody's a winner, but we certainly can have an economic model.
Well, this point about everybody being a winner, and when you mentioned Holland, it brought this to mind as well. This point about Roy Keane not being prepared to tolerate what he regarded as mediocrity. There was a stage when Ireland, in the 2002 campaign, were 2 goals ahead of Holland. Holland came back, and it was regarded then as another memorable Irish victory. And he was making the point that this, for him, identified the key problem. If there had been more Roy Keanes on those Irish teams, do you think you would have been looking at much more success in 2002?
Make no mistake, we had the players to win the World Cup in 2002.
Do we have the attitude, though?
That's questionable. We had the players. You look at some of the teams that progressed to the quarters and semi-finals there, the Japans and the Koreas, they were no better in terms of playing personnel than we were. In fact, Germany were very poor in that tournament, and because of their attitude and their mental fortitude and their history of competing, they went all the way to the World Cup final and got beaten by a very good team.
I don't agree that the attitude that we were prepared to accept second best was around in 2002. I think it was around in 66 when we conceded the playoff venue to Spain when we had a chance of qualifying for the World Cup. And in 62 we reached the European Nations Cup, or European Championship quarter-final, and there was a problem. I think that was sorted out. It's an easy thing for Dunphy and Keane and people like that to say, this attitude still prevails. But I do think that within our culture and within our soccer squad, it had been banished by then. When you see Denmark winning the European Championship, when you see Greece winning the European Championship, professional footballers know. They know these guys. They play with them and club sides. They know they're quite capable of doing it.
But the kind of the reluctance to accept mediocrity, or whatever way you describe it, the keen attitude. If you walk around Dublin city centre nowadays and you see young 30-something professionals, the way they approach work and the way they stoke the fires of the economy is no different than what he was demanding from a football team and a football structure. In any organisation, the organisational structures have to be professional and intact in order to make things work and to do your best in the field of competition. And I suppose Keane is reflected now in terms of all the kind of young whiz kids pushing the economy forward. And with success and with professionalism and with the loss of innocence in terms of the pure joy we used to get from it, you have other problems. Ireland coaches and Irish fans expect success where potentially they don't have any right to anymore. We don't necessarily have as good a bunch of players as we used to have, but back in 15 years ago we didn't expect anything, so it was a much more joyous occasion. Now when we lose to Spain in the penalty shootout, people are clinically depressed because they were expecting bigger things.
But they have a right to be, because we've done nothing. We've been to the quarterfinal of the World Cup, big deal. Uruguay has 3 million people. It's won the World Cup twice.
But those, in respect, those were in like the 30s and the 50s when there was very few teams.
They still qualify for finals. They still go to the Copa America. They go to the final rounds, the semi-finals of the Copa America. I mean, we tend to still have this small island. What can we achieve with our population? In fact, other countries like New Zealand always gets a hatful of Olympic medals, and other soccer teams based in smaller countries. We could get a little bit of a shock from some of them in the forthcoming World Cup.
A point about the Olympics as well, given that it's an Olympics year. When you look back, Ireland's Olympic team was much smaller, much more streamlined this time. Is that a knock-on effect from that same attitude to sporting endeavour, that we're going to send out people? We're not going to send out B people just because we can. We're going to aim for a smaller but a more powerful team.
You can, a well-organised sporting culture can target particular sports, water sports, sports that we punch above our weight like hockey, and come home with better results than we have been doing over the years. I think in soccer, another point that can't be missed from is that soccer was a minority sport when Jack Charlton arrived. It was only played in some parts of Dublin and some of the cities, and he transformed that. The rural Ireland has taken to soccer. Young players are there for the future. I think our under 16 and under 18 successes came from some areas where demographically soccer.
And it also raised questions for the GAA as well, because when there was more attention being focused on soccer, people were beginning to say, why can't we see Houghton in Croke Park? Why can't soccer be played in Croke Park? Do they have to be mutually exclusive, these sports? Do you think it shed any kind of a spotlight on the GAA's role? No one would doubt the GAA's success, but was it coming across as being more insular?
Ironically, I think the success of the soccer team during those years has benefited the GAA. It's got more people involved with a feel-good factor in sport generally. You might argue that the success of the soccer team has led to better rugby performances over the last 10 years, and they certainly have come on. Well, they've had to because of the professional era. But I think sport in general can be boosted, or sporting performances in general can be boosted depending on a nation's confidence and a nation's performance. If you go back to the point about the Olympics, that even more closely parallels economic power than football. With the exception of, say, Cuba, who put a huge proportion of their GDP into sporting training and things like that. You look at the powerhouse economies, and they're the guys that win all the medals.
You go to the United Nations report, and it looks like the medal table.
Exactly.
That's true.
It correlates exactly with it, and it's got to the stage now where professors in Stanford can fairly closely predict what the final medal totals are based on a number of factors like GDP per capita, health and physical infrastructure,
and very important to remember is we perform below our capabilities. Our place in the economic charts is way ahead of where we are in the sporting charts. We have to catch that.
So maybe in the sporting side of things, we need to get a few more multinationals in and start finding some.
We just need to get our act together. It's been very badly.
But can you imagine an Ireland of the 1990s without Charlton? I mean, if you think back to that night in 1987.
Nil all draw. Bulgaria go to the finals. We'd still be talking about the chance we blew with the home matches that time.
But would Charlton have hung around?
Charlton might have hung around for another go at it.
Remember, he only got in by a very convoluted and kind of clandestine sort of arrangement in the first place. I don't think he had a majority of votes.
He wasn't. Not only did he not have a majority of votes, but he wasn't even in the leading candidate after the first round of voting, and somebody changed their vote to get him in. But we'd have gone through qualifying series after qualifying series, and we would be missing it by a hair's breadth, and it would become a bigger deal each time. And it's something that grows in your mind that you've never qualified for the final. It becomes a bigger deal.
Getting to these finals is getting to the top table of the world in terms of national pride, in terms of economic performance, in terms of the feel-good factor for the country generally. And sport is the new.
And should there be even more optimism now when you look back to the European Cup and the victory of Greece?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, what Greece did, what Denmark did in '92, we should be doing it. And the problem is, the so-called soccer success, we didn't win anything. We're now, hopefully, that the economic boom, which was partly generated by the soccer success can now generate a sporting boom that we'll actually come home with a trophy sometime. It would be that would be something we could always be grateful to Mr. Mackay for.
But what about if Mr. Mackay hadn't scored? Would we have lower house prices now and less financial inequality around?
There'd be no problem
That's
getting
it.
a house
Sofia-
because everyone would be emigrating.
There'll be lower house prices in Sofia anyway.
So in terms of, particularly in terms of the current campaign, there's grounds for great optimism there, then, you would think?
I mean, we're thinking differently. We're thinking differently in terms of the way we approach our sport, and businesses that were founded in garages and that alone have gone on to be quoted on the Nasdaq. We've got, we've seen small, with very small enterprises go out and do what the Irish soccer team did on a global scale.
And Ron, do you think the appointment of a homegrown manager as such is quite significant in terms of measure of confidence as well?
I think it's full circle. Yeah. Now, if you see, let's take another analogy. All the American multinationals that came in here came in with their own management and their own management teams. Nowadays, it's Irish people managing multinationals on merit, and there was no reason why an Irish manager couldn't be successful. Maybe we just needed the kick that we got from the Charlton era. I'm not saying he was a particularly good manager, but a combination of luck, good fortune, good timing, it's all kind of contributed. And who knows, maybe we'll see an entire team of Dubliners fairly shortly in the green shirt.
Soccer globalised long before we accepted that the economy was going to, and I think that having a foreign manager impacted on all our heads, and that we accepted we are one of the most globalised economies, and I think that approaching it in sporting terms